It was my privilege 2 years ago to talk about emerging trends at Casual Connect, and one of them was about how publishing was going from a product-centric model, which game publishing has been for in the 30 years from inception, to being a service. We now have in the West about 4 years of experience with publishing as a service, and in East Asia they have now close to about 10 years. So what we want to do over here, we had advertised 5 essential skills, and for showing up over here we're going to give you a bonus 6th. So it's a special for everyone who shows up at 1 o'clock. But we are going to go through each of those with the specific areas that people who have come out of a product background and the games industry in general, where they fail, and then we will end up with the single takeaway for each of these skills that you should consider in how you approach these. It is the observation, and we've interviewed or worked with a large number of companies, that most people are getting some of these right. In fact, I would venture that most people who've been doing this for a year or two are getting most of them right, but the thing that keeps killing them is the parts that they don't particularly understand. And one of the things, I've been having a conversation, particularly with Tig, about why it is that an industry made up of generally quite intelligent people. I don't have the data to support that, so you're just going to have to take this as flattery, but why we continually have problems with understanding the shift from product to service. And one thing that Tig is now going to discuss is perhaps the definition of publishing trips up a lot of the companies out there, because we've seen this happen with small companies and large companies. So Tig, you want to tell the story about the transition and how we ought to think about it.
It's a little like a tag team wrestling match. So, I have a fancy title for my section. It's Atomic Publishing, because you have to have a fancy title, because otherwise, you know. So, when talking about this topic with Eric for quite a long time over the last 2 years or so, we both kind of realized that we were both of a fairly similar mindset. You could say that a lot of the kind of way that we were thinking, and in fact I think most people here were thinking, is that what you used to consider to be publishing, or what we used to talk about when we would say publishing like 20 years ago, or that kind of thing, seems like ancient history. And a lot of the ways that publishers of all sorts of sizes, stripes or scales behave and operate today are already quite different from what you might consider to be a very classical model. So in a sense, the first question that I always sort of find myself asking these days is what was publishing rather than what is, in order to sort of set the scene. And the classic, I suppose, separation or cycle, if you like, of publishing was financing. Developers need money, therefore I pay for their games, that kind of thing. Stewardship, which would be to say, you know, looking after milestones, vetting games, making sure they're good quality, making sure that any of the issues or problems that developers were having were kind of being solved, clearing through all sorts of stuff that, if you like, kind of would act as roadblocks to the product. Production, literally physically printing and boxing things. Promotion, advertising, PR, all that sort of stuff. And distribution, and pushing it out to retail channels. And that's, you know, Sega Mega Drive cartridges, Super Nintendo games, PC disc box games, like all that sort of stuff. Even into kind of early 2000s, PS2, PS3, like a lot of that, if you like, very kind of sort of packaged model would sort of be how it would work. And the publisher then would be able to turn it around and get back into financing new games and essentially kind of do the same thing over and over. And it was a cycle. It was an engine, rather. And it was based on the idea of, this is Theodore Sturgeon, sorry. It was based on the idea that although 95% of all games that come out, 95% of everything is crud, the 5%, the 1 in every 20, the occasional hit, was the thing that essentially paid for all the rest. Because we all say that games is a hit-driven business. It always has been a hit-driven business. And it is the case that for every company from EA through Activision down to Take-Two, down to whoever, they always relied on trying to find one gem out of about a few projects that they were trying to manage. And that's essentially how they kind of defray the cost. And it worked pretty well. Publishing was also, if you like, the connective tissue of the industry. It wasn't just a sort of a thing that happened in isolation. A lot of developers spoke and continue to speak developer. A lot of platforms continue to speak platform. A lot of retailers and all that sort of stuff continue to speak retail, and they don't all really understand each other's concerns. And so an effective publisher often you would act as the sort of bridge. You'd be the person who'd be able to talk to this guy, talk to this guy, and effectively make his work on his system, and everybody sort of gets on. So they kind of acted a lot as if you like, a kind of a translator function. They acted a lot as a kind of linking layer and that kind of thing. Publishing was also a form of arbitrage. It was essentially taking things and adding value and helping to distribute them, and the value that was added was essentially the profit margin, and so it goes. So everybody had a piece of a fairly complicated pie, and when that works very well, everybody did very well out of it. It led to some fairly healthy profits, and in some cases some extreme profits for some companies, and led to some of today's major corporations. Publishing is also a form of cultural curation. So for instance, what titles a publisher would choose to promote and therefore fund would in a sense kind of lead to genres, and would in a sense kind of lead to certain stratified categories of games becoming, if you like, what games are, he said, like, jokingly, or that kind of thing. In a sense, publishers, and you see the same thing in music and books and whatever, like the kinds of things that get promoted as sort of tend to define the conversation around the medium itself. And so publishing played a very responsible or irresponsible, depending on how you look at it, role around shaping what the medium was considered to be. And then, does that come out quite well? No, it doesn't. Okay, then came digital distribution. I mean, you all know, and you all run into the sort of the symptoms and the after effects of this kind of story all the time, but they have changed publishing quite significantly. So the first example is community. Reddit, for instance, has replaced a lot of the curative or curational sort of things that publishing used to do. So we don't necessarily need taste curation in the same way. We don't necessarily really care that much about, if you like, a kind of a managed push catalog or a managed kind of definition of what the medium is. And a good example of this is games like Minecraft. We continually see stories, in fact, Flappy Bird even only last week, we continually see stories in the gaming media these days of the game that nobody expected, and oh my god, and everybody who's in the publishing layer seems to be scrambling a lot to try and understand all this. Like that the weird curative chaos that is people has largely overtaken the kind of the story, let's kind of sort of do this A, B, C, D, E kind of methodology. Arbitration's been squeezed. So the nice complicated pie works very well when you're able to charge $40 and $50 a game because everybody can case their piece. But in, say, the app economy, where everything is 69 cents, it's very difficult, or free, it's very difficult to really form large enough margins to sort of form sustainable, replaceable patterns, the sort of things that publishing is very used to. 70-30 splits for developer to platform revenue, for example, are very different from the old sort of 6 to 10% that developers used to get on top of, or out of the piece of the pie. Games have largely become services. We're talking about publishing as a service, but there's lots of games that are just straight up and down vertical services these days. A good example, games like EVE Online, which has been around for a while, it really just manages its entire self, its conversation. Every single part of it is all just kind of within this one entity, and it doesn't really need much in the way of kind of outside help. A lot of the Zynga is an example of a company that's entirely just these giant services that it all just manages all by itself. And so the opportunities or the need or the necessity for third or second parties to become involved in publishing, whatever that's supposed to be, have become very limited in many cases. The costs of development have dropped. A huge amount of great tools like Unity have made it much easier for a lot of people to get into making games. The cost of distribution dropped. Tools like or places like the App Store make it possible for games to seed to 1 million or 10 million or 100 million people at essentially zero cost. And the result is that the number of games has vastly multiplied. So everybody here, I'm sure, at some point or another has been made aware of things like the discoverability problem in mobile. And that's a net effect of the fact that there's hundreds of thousands of people just diving into the games industry, and there's hundreds of thousands of titles all competing for space. So it's bad in one sense, but it does reflect the idea that since everybody can democratically get in, you don't have that 1 to 20 reliability that publishing used to rely on, like the Sturgeon's Law kind of thing. It's not the case that like 5% of all digitally distributed games are good. It's like 0.1% of all digital. So the number, in terms of like being able to defray the risks of 19 failed titles versus one successful title, that doesn't really work when it's trying to defray the risk of 999 failed titles versus one successful title. And so yeah, so that engine, that nice little diagram that I heard earlier, it's kind of blown up, and it's resulted in what may have been a very viable third-party layer, gathering all of these functions into one kind of package and then presenting them all to the world, that the stresses that have resulted have caused a number of businesses to diverge in various directions. So today, what is publishing? So one example is a sort of big vertical mega publishing is a really bad name, but anyway, the idea that a company like Activision these days doesn't really deal anymore with third parties. It just doesn't. It just buys it all in-house, and it runs the entire of the development of something like Call of Duty as one giant vertical operation in its own doors. That you have maybe 6, maybe 10 essentially campus publishers these days who don't really need outsiders anymore, and who don't, as a result, go looking around for third-party deals in the same way that they used to when I joined the industry 12 years ago. There's not too many of them, though. The other one then is single franchise style publishers. So I mentioned CCP early on. They've tried to branch out into a couple of other games, but it hasn't really worked. But they do have this one bedrock franchise that just kind of keeps trundling and trundling and trundling. Jagex in the UK is another example. They got RuneScape. It just keeps going and going and going. Moshi Monsters keeps going and going and going. eRepublic, and quite a few other of those kinds of publishers. They're just operating essentially a sole .com property that appears maybe on a couple of different platforms and operates through subscriptions or free-to-play or whatever the model happens to be. But their entire concern is essentially just one entirely vertical unit that they just keep running themselves, and they're not necessarily that interested in branching out. Rovio is actually arguably a kind of a single franchise publisher. Although it has several games, they're all kind of in that one Angry Birds kind of blob. And then you get cross promoters. So you get, people like Zynga, you get people like BigPoint, you get people within, say, the mobile sphere who are all worried about essentially maintaining a kind of a meta audience around a number of titles and keep kind of, if you like, distilling or decanting users from one into the other all the time. There's a lot of those lately. But the kind of disruptive forces that have kind of led at least to those kinds of entities forming, they're not actually done yet. We still are seeing an awful lot. It's not like that we've replaced one kind of engine with another kind of engine and everything's fine. I think a lot of people, particularly in the app space, for example, this year are staring into 2014, and there's lots of very dark murmurs about what the hell is going on and how far can it go? At what point is it going to become stable? And the answer is it might not very well. The sorts of heroes that we see these days, the kinds of people who, if you like, are the mosquitoes who grow, they're not actually lasting very long. That what you seem to notice a lot is people like Zynga and BigPoint and all that kind of stuff. They're maybe sort of rising very, very quickly, but equally they all seem to be running into quite serious structural issues very, very quickly as well, that we don't really have, in the new sort of era of things, we don't really have publishers that have the same storied sort of legacy developing around them as someone like Nintendo does. Or it seems like it's a very, very difficult battle for them to really be able to establish longevity to any great degree. So every year there are new hero companies, new people that apparently are going to be the new hot ticket, but 6 months later, you're not really hearing that much about them anymore. And if that's an example of the disruptive effects that have led to those companies being mushrooming in the first place, is still actually undoing them at the same time. You get a lot of things like flameouts, you get a lot of things like stalled IPOs, you're getting a lot of things like stagnation, you're getting a lot of things like companies that maybe sort of get to a certain level and then just seem to kind of stop, or just seem to become very entrenched very quickly, or something like that. You're getting to the point where arguably the publisher entity, or the idea of a publisher as a sort of a single unit company that is trying to manage a number of sort of core skill competencies, may very well be the thing that's actually not that relevant anymore. That where we used to sort of think in terms of, as I say, this connective tissue that helped to bond everything together, we could be looking at something a little more fragmented. But that doesn't mean developers don't need help. Of course they do. That million number of developers working in the App Store type of thing, what are they all obsessed about all the time? They're trying to find money, they're trying to find discoverability, they're trying to help solve a lot of problems that they still have. They're just not necessarily looking to find one giant partner to sort of handle all of it and take a majority of the revenue as a result. They're looking for much more nimble mini partners to sort of take on parts of what they're doing. And so this is where I came up with this idea that it's atomic. Rather than publishing being one long chain molecule, that you have these little parts, these little bits, if you like, little sort of demi-services that are being provided to developers. And so in a sense, developers kind of have a lot more power in that model, but mini atomic publishers have a lot more flexibility to work across different sort of parts of the market. They're not as tied into the life and death of particular properties. So this might be broken. But this sort of new kind of pieces of skills might be what the new engine sort of looks like. So maybe not necessarily fronting all the money for developers themselves, but helping them connect to finance is a good example, like being the bridge toward financing. I know there's a number of people who are trying to get into that. Maybe not stewarding titles from start to finish, but helping to consult on a number of games all at once and helping them to improve, if you like, in mini. Maybe not doing the full-on production work, but helping, being a middleware provider, someone like Unity, and helping people find the tools that they need to do the production work themselves. Maybe not being a promotional sort of entity in the old school sense of like spending millions of dollars in campaigns, but assisting with things like discovery and cross-promotion, all that kind of stuff to help developers, again, find their own way. And finally, maybe not distribution in the old school sense of printing discs and boxes and all that sort of thing, but working with platforms to help developers kind of get their games out there. So the kind of services that people like this are sort of providing, so Swerve, for example, providing sort of metrics of player analysis, Tilting Point trying to provide help to developers while help for financing and all that kind of thing, but helping them retain the power at the same time. Chartboost acting as a cross-promotional layer to help games get pushed around, but Chartboost is not necessarily interested in being a full-on publisher all by itself. And so what will publishing be?
Thanks. Yes. Okay. Okay, so we're now going to get into the nitty-gritty of what this means for you. But first, let's talk about the key issues on service versus product that trip people up. Atoms versus bits. We're in a world, we grew up in a world in which shiny disk in cardboard box was delivered, and now we have something where the player can get the thing delivered over the internet immediately. That has huge effects. For example, much of the reviewing process is broken. So for example, Elder Scrolls Online was just released, and a lot of people are criticizing it because the opening sequence is done for a game that requires spending $50 or £50 or €50 up front, and yet, you know, the Elder Scrolls Online thing is set up based on a product model where they know that once you spent your €50 that you're going to stick with them through the opening sequence, however boring it is. Second of all, developers can be publishers, and one of the nice things is in the old days, if you were a wildly successful developer, you were independent and had a huge hit, you would have to hire sales staff, you would have to develop relationships with software, etc. You can now be a self-publisher, and there is now beginning to be the superstructure of the sorts of companies that Tig represented that can sort it out. There's post-launch considerations. It used to be, we all grew up in a world where if the box was bought in the game store and did not come back within 48 hours, there was a 96 to 98% chance that it was sold through. This number did not vary over a 20-year period. The idea of operations, the idea that you would actually have to service the game afterward is a foreign concept to most of us who grow up in the game industry. Previously, the only operations in post-launch was doing the patch when the bug occurred and it caused it to explode. And the other thing is, after 20 years in which the business model did not really change, the developer cannot avoid being in the business of games. And one of the takeaways that I hope that you people take is that no matter how small a developer you are, someone has got to be responsible for understanding the business side, and that should be somebody on the creative or development team. So the first decision on programming is whether you do one title versus multiple titles, and Todd covered that earlier. The atomic unit of a title changes. So, now you work for a couple years, or you used to work for a couple years, 3 years, throw the product out into the marketplace. Now, in theory, a game should last forever and has to be structured that way. The next decision is what sort of weight you attach to a title. Previously, when you were putting things out as a product, you would think entirely in terms of it had to be up to industry standard. But now with MVP, with minimum viable product and fast failures and so on, you can actually do something where you can deliver something that can be done at the highest possible level or at the lowest level that an early adopter will be satisfied with it. The next issue is that business parameters have greater weight. If you do not build monetization into design, if you do not think about what your payment strategies are, if you are not thinking about that up front, then you are not going to succeed in the service world. And then the last question that you have to think about is in terms of franchise development. And this is not just this can be franchise development can be anything from licensing someone else's property, like Lord of the Rings, or it can be something about saying we are going to we are going to go the Angry Birds route, where we're going to end up doing a bunch of related products, or we're going to go something like the Eve route, where we're going to try and do one continuous service, one continuous thing in which everybody interacts. Deployment. The mistake that most people make is they start by saying, we're going to do something for iOS, or they're going to do for Android, or we're going to do something for the web. This is a critical decision, but the first decision you need to make is what is the player relationship with the device? Are you designing for a tablet? Are you designing for a PC with a device with a mouse? Are you designing for a television set? Once you've made that decision, then you decide what the platform is going. Then you decide what the platform is going to be. Because if you don't start by designing for, figuring out what the use case is, we have seen far too many games that were optimized for smartphone and then put onto tablet, or vice versa, or ended up being some sort of dog's breakfast, which was in between the two of them. The next is territories. I'm an American, and we Americans have the luxury of a homogeneous main market. You Europeans, of course, have it all over us in terms of understanding the differences in languages and the various national polities. And then the Asians have the advantage that they are a culture that has been pretty good at making it difficult for people to come into it. But you need to think about what territories you're going to go into, which leads into the next decision, which is primary versus partner provision. Is this something that you are going to take care of yourself, or is this something that you're going to ask somebody else to be able to take on for you? And again, the example that most often gets taken is that Asian companies end up being the ones that people end up partnering with. And the last issue on deployment that is unusual is the idea of staging. In the US, the New York Broadway theater market, plays would try out in New Haven, and they would see how they played in New Haven, they would adjust them. Here we tend to try in three countries tend to be the most popular. Canada, which is the closest cognate to the US, Ireland, which is the closest which is the cognate for Europe, and the Philippines, which is dealing with people who have a much lower per capita income. This again creates another shift where you have something where you can go to a market where you can afford to fail and then be able to play it out. Direct marketing. The internet is the greatest direct marketing medium ever invented, and what we have become incredibly focused on acquisition because the cost continues to go up and it becomes the single largest cost. Tomorrow we will have, incidentally, the British, probably the most celebrated speaker on direct marketing will be giving an interview on how it applies. But the industry is focused on the two ends of this. They've focused on acquisition and customer service. So what they do is you spend so much time worrying about acquiring a user that you forget to spend time on retention. And a lot of people do not sit and go through all the lifetime value decisions that people make. In other words, you can get money from them now, but you can get the most money from them up front. But if you do that, you may be leaving a lot of money on the table. There is, of course, a spectacular object lesson in this field of Zynga. Zynga did an extraordinarily good job. At one point, Farmville was the single most popular game in the world. And it hit a peak of 70 million users, which, if you go back several years, that was a big number. I mean, now 70 million is a small number, but let's cast back about 3 years ago. And they went from, by being aggressive about trying to get the most money as fast as they could, first they started to lose all the newbies, and then when they turned it into a roach motel, that is, Tig, don't leave, no wait, here's another offer, here's something else, they ended up not only losing the lifetime customer value, but they ended up losing customers, so much so that a marketing-driven company ended up having to do something incredibly desperate. They had to take the game back and give it to a game designer. That was how desperate they were. Upsell is something, these are all arts that have been perfected over 150 years. The modern direct marketing started when John Montgomery Ward, who started one of the great US catalogs, the Montgomery Ward catalog, which was like the Sears catalog, and so on, has been doing this. There are plenty of people out there who understand to do this and apply it to selling magazines, who apply it to selling credit card services, all of which is fairly applicable to games because you are in the relationship business. And customer service, we've sort of gotten we've gotten the idea of community, but we have not. We're just beginning to put together relation management, loyalty programs, tiering, and engagement. All of these are things that you want to be in if you are in the business where you are trying to get people to pay, to pay after they pay for the initial product. These are probably the single most crucial skills that you're going to need to be able to learn if you want to be able to ensure your revenue stream. Okay, monetization. For years, the industry was able to say, there's the creative side and there's the monetization side, and never the twain shall meet. That it was because for 20 years, as I said earlier, there were only two models that mattered. There was sell the game to the wholesaler for 40% of the price and then see what it ends up, see if someone can get it from a discount store, or there was the MMO model where you bought the initial game and then you paid $9.95 a month or $12.95 a month or $14.95 a month. If you do not think about your monetization when you do the game design in this service world, then you will almost certainly fail. By the way, one way you can avoid the trouble is you can have something that is such a spectacular hit that you can make money without just by being around. Flappy Birds did that model, so if you can do 50 million downloads in a short period of time, this is not a problem. For everybody else, it's something that you have to think through. You have to start by thinking about what the appropriate model is, and this goes double for existing game IP. For those of you if you haven't seen what's happening with Dungeon Keeper, which was a very powerful name 10, 15 years ago, which the Mythic Studio has just brought out, they have ended up putting a model that was inappropriate and in fact are getting absolutely lambasted in the press because they're doing things like saying, because they want to keep the Dungeon Keeper mechanics, they're doing things like saying, you cannot proceed without giving it a 5-star rating. In other words, if you try and give a 1 or 4-star rating, you will not go in. This sort of thing, trying to put the two together, is going to cause them to have a very rocky launch and probably not get anything but the true devotees. The next thing is that you have to go into what Tig refers to as the dark arts. This is a matter of the ethics that you end up doing. So One thing you have to do is keep track of the ad networks, again, have to do aggressive margin wars and so on and so forth. So we have partners who are encouraging us to do some fairly aggressive and, shall we say, anti-player tactics. If you were at Paul Gardner's talk earlier, you heard him discuss all the various depredations that can be done against children, but also applies against adults. And then the next question, again, sorry to pick on Dungeon Keeper because several of the developers are people who are friends of mine, but this sort of thing about saying that, saying essentially, we want to empty your pockets and give us your wallet, which a lot of people are doing, is the sort of thing that does not build long-term value for your company, and also creates a problem for the entire industry. Three tactical issues you have to think about. Payment methods, you have to start by thinking about how you're going to get paid if it's not going to be entirely through something like the App Store where they've already thought through all this before you even start. You have to figure out the types of payments. Are you going to emphasize ads? Are you going to emphasize subscriptions? Are you going to go for intermediate process? And then you have to, and this is where the business issue goes, you have to think about management of providers. One interesting thing that's occurring is that the providers, the outside people who supply the publishing services to you, actually would like you guys to think more about how you manage them. It used to be that at conferences as recently as last year, people would say to me, do you know somebody at this publisher? Or do you know someone I can meet to talk about our services? Now what they say is we want to meet with companies that have thought through the issues about which will give them the biggest bang for the buck, because then they have a chance of knowing how to make the sale to you guys. In other words, the industry is matured enough that your partners want you to be thinking about this as a business because they know that there will be a greater chance of being able to be successful with you. Which leads into analytics. I observed about a year ago that just like when small children learn a word, they repeat it over and over again, analytics was the word that people thought that they discovered over here. So one of the things you have to think about is how you source. It is a game industry trope that we always want to be able to do things in-house because we're engineers, we're people who create our own stuff, we always know we can do something better that will be created for the product. Well, one, you probably can't because you haven't grown up in the analytics field. Two, even if you can, you probably could be spending that time coming up with better games. Now, the reason why you have to do, I'll turn around, the reason why you have to do something that's a hybrid is there are some wonderful outside packages, there are lots of wonderful outside packages, they do a lot of things, and they're designed as one size fits all. So there will become a point fairly early in the development that you have to make a decision about which package does not, does most of what you need, and the things that it doesn't do are less annoying to you. One thing about analytics is you have to figure out to manage whether they are master or servant of publishing. This is something that I hear from every house. Analytics overtake design. Many successful companies have been driven by what are the latest results. Okay, we have to change everything based on what happened last week. And by the way, in the example I gave you earlier of Zynga with Farmville, there were, over the first 40 weeks, where it went from 0 to 70 million players, there were 42 different versions of Farmville. Some of them were very, very good, but by the last 10 to 20 versions of it, they all had been driven by decisions about how they could make a little bit more money now, and the net result was they made a game that was driven by analytics, not by what was the best possible game. And this leads to the toxic behaviors that analysts cause. And by the way, I think analysts are extraordinarily important. Good ones are incredibly valuable, but they are not the people who drive the entertainment. So when you're failing, you say, oh my God, we must listen to what the analysts are telling us because we must correct it by whatever the numerical results that we're seeing. When you're succeeding, you say, oh my God, we must stay with every other game or every other module we put out must have the same qualities that the last ones that had. And what happens is you become something where you get driven programmatically rather than put together a game. It is a very tough thing. And now I want to give, having bashed on Zynga, I want to give them a compliment. They brought in someone who had been a GM of Yandex and of Yahoo, in other words, web services. And he implemented a policy that worked very well for a short period before he was replaced, which was that the analysts fed in, but then the product manager, the person in charge, would take the alchemy of understanding. In other words, you applied analytics, but only up to a certain point, and the rest had to be design decisions about understanding whether or not these had long-term consequences, whether it reinforced the gameplay. Operations is, of course, something that is peculiar to a service. One of the first things that you have to think about is how you're going to allocate resources in developing a game between development and operations. Put simply, if you plan to put more money on the development side, that is before launch, then the better you are preparing to fail. Because the successful games always will be the ones that last longer, that require additional effort, and so the ones that succeed will be the ones that end up spending money. For example, on Clash of Clans, Supercell has long passed the point of spending 30 to 40 times more after the release of Clash of Clans than they did before launch. And they did a fairly long gestation period, over a year, to put it together. The next thing is that operations evolves on an as-needed basis. Even though you have to plan for operations being the largest part of what you're doing, you cannot plan ahead. So you should not start by assuming that you need 25 community managers and hiring them beforehand, because you don't know how the game is going to play. On the other extreme, Riot Games is now in the process, which does League of Legends, is now in the process of hiring 2,500 people just to manage the game across several different territories. Also, if you can get a chance to see the talk that Victor Kisley of Wargaming.net did at the VentureBeat conference in October, he talks about the need to be able to devolve authority to the various service bureaus. But the more you succeed, the more you will become an operations business. Commingling of functions. Basically, the old product model is you finish the game and you throw it over the wall. You must have people in the service, you must have someone, and possibly several someones in common between the development team and the operations team. If they're the same people, it's not an issue. But you cannot just say, here's the development team and we're going to hand it over to operations. There has to be some pre-planning and some design, which is how it's going to go forward. You also make the decision between soft launches and hard launches. You can do a number of different launches. You can put out a game to a small group of people in small territories, or you can say we're going to do one big tentpole development. But in any event, operations considerations have to go throughout the entire service organization. Not just development, not just marketing, but things like finance, because again, it will end up being the largest thing. It has to affect every decision you make if you're a service company. So Tig and I came up with one takeaway for people who grew up in product. The first is that programming is business strategy. By programming, I mean the titles that you come up with. If you do not think through your business strategy and you're just thinking about making the greatest possible game, I'm sorry to say you will fail. There is a notable exception, which is Supercell is a company that has recently acknowledged that their marketing is not absolutely world-class. They made such a good game that was so well developed that they were able to succeed despite that, but there are very few exceptions out there. Then make sure you have the staff, the games, and the structures for what you're trying to do. Many developers try and take people who were extremely skilled console designers and put them over to service products because they want to keep the same staff and they're going to read a few things and so on and so forth. Think through whether or not you have the right people, or at least get someone who has the DNA of doing a service product. Next, you're in the relationship business. I know that I know that games, especially in F2P world, are all about, you have to be able to get the money. But if you want to be able to get the most money, you need to build relationships with your customers. An unnatural monetization fit is a recipe for Frankenstein. We gave the Dungeon Keeper example. Analytics have the potential to take over your entire product. You have to make sure that they are in service of rather than running the entire company. And then operations are something that evolves and is something that is an evolutionary process. Thank you very much, and I think we'll now take, we've been talking to you, and now we'll be pleased to take any questions you may have.